Good afternoon, everybody, and welcome to the third session of our Sustainable Finance Seminar at the University of Zurich. I am very happy to welcome today Augustin Landier from HEC in Paris with his paper titled ESG Investing, How to Optimize Impact. A small backstory to this paper is that there was a conference scheduled in Zurich in another era when we all were still expecting to sit together in a room that was organized by Stephen Ongina. And that is where I discovered this paper, and I was really looking forward to go to this session. And then unfortunately the conference was canceled. But we are so lucky to have Augustin join us today and present the paper sort of in a replacement of this. And yes, I'm looking forward to the session, and Augustin, the floor is yours.
Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. This is joint work with Stefano Lovo, a colleague at HEC. If you want to intervene, please don't hesitate to speak up, as I'm not sure I will see the chat room tools or other kind of tools. So please don't hesitate to voice if you want to ask a question. So let me tell you a little bit what the paper is about. So I'm not going to spend too much time motivating it, especially here with this audience, but basically negative externalities by companies have clearly been up on the policy agenda in the previous years. The traditional tools developed by the economic profession to solve these externalities are Pigouvian taxes or pollution permits like cap and trade. But I think it's fair to say that the effect of these traditional tools so far have been somewhat disappointing, probably due to the fact that they don't address free riding among countries. They are not very immune, let's say, to lobbying frictions, to popular protests. You know, anytime taxes are increased. So, for example, the Yellow Jacket protest in France were triggered by a rise in the gas taxes. And they also are subject to political short-termism. After all, politicians have to be re-elected and therefore have a pretty short-term horizon when it comes to addressing externalities. You need a long-term horizon. So what the paper does is basically asking, okay, if we assume basically that these tools are not available, how far can the financing channel help changing the way companies behave, and can it help forcing them to internalize externalities? So there is clearly a rise of the topic in finance. This is not at all science fiction. There is already a pretty well-structured ESG finance, and broadly defined, like this is all the financial products that try to have an impact on the environment, and in particular regarding climate change. And so if you put together all these different financial products, you basically see that they add up to a pretty large fraction of total assets under management. At the same time, when you look more closely, you will see that a lot of these products or funds don't have very tight ESG policies. For example, simply avoiding the tobacco industry or the coal industry will be enough to be eligible in that list of SRI asset managers. But these numbers are just to show you that the theme has become quite mainstream, right? A large fractions of asset managers currently are presenting themselves to their clients as taking into account these ESG issues. And so that's where we start, in a sense. So we want to say, okay, does it make sense? Like, can these funds actually have an impact in reducing externalities? And if yes, how does that work? And so when you start asking this question, I think there are two constraints, which are also a little bit paradoxes in the way ESG funds typically present the impact they have. So the first constraint is the necessity to have competitive returns. So I think it's difficult to attract investors if you cannot at least promise them returns that are competitive, meaning that, you know, in expectation they are going to provide at least the same kind of risk-adjusted returns as other funds. And actually, when you look at the way ESG funds are marketing themselves, they typically promise that, you know, their returns will be competitive or even better than regular funds. The second constraint that has to be taken very seriously, I think, when we try to have a foundation for ESG financing, is capital substitutability. So the idea is, you know, if a fraction of investors boycott a company, that company can seek capital elsewhere from agnostic investors. And so unless you have really like a very, very large fraction of investors boycotting a company, it's not clear that ESG investors can have an impact on the ways companies behave. Okay, they might basically change the shareholder structure of the companies that they target. These companies will have to find capital from agnostic investors, but it's not clear that the cost of capital is going to react strongly, in a sense, to these boycotts. So these are the two constraints that I want to put at the core of our modeling and take really seriously without assuming that markets are inefficient. So a typical marketing argument that you will find in the ESG funds industry is the idea that markets are inefficient, they underreact to climate change issues, and therefore you can have abnormal profitable returns by investing in companies that take climate change seriously or that are compatible with tighter policies tackling climate change. And I think these arguments, you know, maybe they are going to be right in the short term, or maybe they have been right recently, but they are unlikely to be sustainable in the sense of, you know, like, I think if really climate change becomes a major theme, and I think it is already a major theme, it is unlikely that markets are going to keep underreacting to that theme. Okay, so that's a little bit the background. If you want, I mean, a sentence I like to quote is a sentence by Bill Gates. In a sense, Bill Gates shares the view that you need to really take into account these substitution effects seriously if you want to pretend that you have an impact. This is a quote from an interview he gave to the FT last year, where he says, look, all these divestment initiatives by the finance industry to date probably have reduced about 0 tons of emissions. It's not like you have capital starved the people making steel or gasoline. I don't know the mechanism of action they hope for. And so that's exactly what we are going to try to answer, like what kind of economic mechanism can actually lead to companies changing their behavior if we assume that ESG investors cannot afford to have lower returns than their competitor funds. So there is already a pretty big literature, I mean, and you guys are already familiar with it. In a sense, if I wanted to map a little bit things and just mention a few papers, and it doesn't do justice, obviously, to the whole corpus of papers on this theme. So Omke and Hopp have a paper that has similar flavors in the sense of, you know, like really like underlying the idea that having a good carbon footprint doesn't make you a strong, impactful ESG fund, and that in a sense, if your goal is to maximize impact, you need to think about, you know, the mechanism for impact. And so they model that in with a route different from us, in the sense that they put the principal agent problem between managers and investors at the core of their model. So it's more of a corporate finance kind of flavor. I think it's also, I mean, if there is one paper in a sense that is in the background of all this, it's the Heinkel, Krauss, Zechner paper, 2001, which is the first paper that, to my knowledge, provides an equilibrium view of how ESG investors can have an impact on companies. And so in their paper, the mechanism is the following. The idea is if ESG investors boycott dirty companies, those dirty companies will have to basically be more concentrated in the portfolio of the agnostic investors, those that don't care about, let's say, the climate or externalities in general. And therefore, they will have to promise a higher return to these investors, a higher expected return to these investors due to the lack of diversification that basically is going to happen in equilibrium. But when you calibrate, so I think it works in logically, meaning that if many people boycott companies, the cost of capital of these companies increase. But when you calibrate these models, you find that actually the impact on the cost of capital is not large unless you have like a very, like quasi-majority, I mean, quasi-unanimous propagation of the ESG concerns in among investors. I mean, you will need like, a very large fraction of investors being ESG investors for this mechanism to actually impact strongly the cost of capital of companies, because actually diversification is pretty big, and so boycotting one company is not going to have a huge impact on the portfolio of the other guys. Anyway, so that's sort of the background. I would say, on the question, which is also in the background of this paper, about whether companies that behave well provide better stock returns or lower stock returns. I think the evidence is quite ambiguous, and you will find papers in both giving opposite arguments. So you have the, papers like the Hong and Kasperczyk paper that shows that vicious companies, like the tobacco industry, have higher expected returns, in line with the view that the role of ESG investors is to increase the cost of capital of these companies. So higher cost of capital means higher expected returns. But you also have a bunch of papers that suggest underreaction of the markets to ESG information, like Edmonds, for example. So, that's, and we're not going to basically like take a view on that. We're going to assume that markets are efficient and that information is priced appropriately. So what do we do? So it's going to be a general equilibrium approach where we model the production of goods by companies that exercise an externality on individuals. Individuals and companies are selfish in the sense that they don't care about externalities. We need a friction. I will show you that, in a frictionless world, in a sense, the model becomes degenerate. So the friction we use is quite key, in a sense, to the message of the paper. And then, so we are going to introduce in that equilibrium an ESG fund that seeks to maximize social welfare, but subject to the constraint that it needs to provide competitive returns to its investors. So what I will call impact in this paper is going to be precisely defined. Impact is what happens when the ESG fund is present in the economy versus the laissez-faire equilibrium where you only have like selfish intermediaries in the economy. So let me give a little preview of the results we get, and it's also a way, for me later in the talk, if you guys have questions on some of these issues, to really focus on what you are more interested about. So a first result is, absent financial frictions, there is just no possibility for the ESG fund to have an impact in this model. So you need the financial friction. So what I will show is that policies that just consist in having industry tilts, like, think about, having a portfolio where you eliminate some industries because they are too brown industries. This kind of policy by itself has no impact. Impact is going to require announcing pollution limits to the companies that you finance. So the ESG fund has to step in and say, look, this is the requirement to be eligible to the pool of capital that I control. And of course, the fund needs to be committed to that policy and finance only companies that are compliant to the policy that is announced. Okay, result number 4. The impact of this ESG fund on a given industry is going to increase one, with the amount of capital that the ESG fund is investing in this industry, and second, with the financial friction in that industry. So for example, think about an industry that is mostly composed of smaller companies. Probably that's an industry where it's easier to have an impact as an ESG fund. So message number 5, and maybe that's the core message of the paper, is that the supply chain network can be used to amplify the impact. And this is in line with some empirical studies that show that there is sort of contamination of CSR along the supply chain, meaning that companies that try to become more environmental friendly impose some standards, some constraints on their own suppliers, and so on. And so that basically creates a multiplier effect, if you want, to the actions of the ESG fund. Okay, and the 6th message is the simple environmental footprint of a fund portfolio, like, you know, the carbon footprint of the portfolio. That's not a good measure of how much impact you have as an investor. So even if you tell me, look, my portfolio is mostly invested in brown industries, even if you are not directly an active investor engaging companies, it might still be that your portfolio has more impact than the portfolio of a fund that is purely invested in industries that do not pollute. Okay, so what I will do is I will show you a very simplified partial equilibrium one sector version of the model, just to show you the mechanics and just, you know, give you a sense of what makes the model work. And then I will plunge that simple element in a multiple sector general equilibrium version of the model. But basically, it will have helped a lot for the intuition to have this one sector model in the background. It will make it more transparent what the trick of the model is. And then I will discuss how the supply chain can be used in this multiple sector model. And then I will conclude by giving the practical implications that I think are implied by the model, and that can be useful in a sense if we want to give advice to policymakers or to practitioners that want to have an impact. Okay, so let me start with the model. So here are the ingredients. So there is a mass 1 of atomistic capitalists. Each of them has 1 unit of capital, so they need to find a way to use that capital to put it at work. And then there is on the other side a mass 1 of entrepreneurs, which each of them can run 1 firm. And to run 1 firm, they need to find 1 unit of capital. Okay, so these 2 masses of capitalists and entrepreneurs, they need to be matched so that production can happen. So production function is very simple. So once you have 1 unit of capital, your production is E exponent beta. F is just F like firm, it's just the index of firms. So what you see here is that the more you pollute, the more you produce. If you wanted to produce with 0 pollution, that's just impossible. You will pollute 0. And, you know, the more you allow yourself to pollute, the more you are able to produce large quantities. Okay, so it's a way to model the fact that pollution is actually making production easier in terms of the cost of production. Okay. So now let's look at what the consumers experience. So they basically consume C, so they like consumption, and they dislike aggregate emissions, aggregate pollution, big E. Okay, so that's why their utility function is C divided by 1 plus big E exponent delta. Delta basically controls how much pollution is painful. And basically there is clearly a trade-off between consuming a lot versus, you know, the negative externality of pollution. So because people care only about aggregate pollution, that means that they will not internalize the externality, right? Because as a consumer, when I consume from a company, I have only a marginal impact on pollution that is totally diluted into aggregate pollution. So I cannot change aggregate pollution. Okay. So actually the equilibrium, it's really, it's more a partial equilibrium, but here laissez-faire leads to pollution being maximum. So firms choose a level of E equal to 1, which is the maximum level that is feasible. And the social optimal, so if there was a social planner that could impose to companies how much they pollute, the optimum will be smaller than 1, and it will integrate the trade-off between beta and delta. So on the one hand, beta tells you that polluting is efficient. It's difficult to pollute, to produce a lot if you cannot pollute. And on the other hand, delta tells you that pollution is painful, right? And so basically the trade-off between the two parameters gives you the optimal solution. Okay. So now let me introduce an ESG fund. So let me put a bit of structure on how people manage their capital. So investors, they have this unit of capital, and I assume they delegate investment to intermediaries that collect capital and manage it. And so you have two types of funds. On the one hand, you have standard funds that care only about financial returns, and you have one ESG fund that maximizes social welfare. And so here come the constraints that I think are important. So investors are selfish. They will invest in the funds that provide the highest returns. So if the ESG fund has lower returns than other funds, it's just going to collect zero amounts of capital and it will become irrelevant. So conditional on the ESG fund providing same returns as competitors, I will assume that there is an exogenous fraction smallest, of total capital that is invested in this ESG fund. And so for now, I will take this parameter S as exogenous. And later, if we have time, we have a section in the paper where we endogenize S. But like to go to the data in a sense, I think of S as fairly exogenous in the sense that some countries have a sovereign wealth fund, which is or is not an ESG fund. There are pension funds that sometimes are not ESG. So basically, S varies a lot with institutional details in a country. Okay, so now what is the ESG fund policy? So basically, the ESG fund is announcing, after it has collected capital, that it will lend only to firms which have a level of pollution E smaller than E hat, which is the maximum threshold allowed by the ESG fund. And so here is the exact timing of events. So the ESG fund announces policy E hat. Then each entrepreneur chooses its own level of pollution that it chooses. So if it complies, it's going to choose basically to pollute exactly E hat, and there will be no reasons to go below that. And then entrepreneurs search for capital and the amount of pollution embedded in their technology is visible to the capitalists that have to choose whether to give them one unit of capital or not. Okay, so the last ingredient I need is the matching friction. So basically the idea is the following. It's to say, look, if I'm an entrepreneur and I choose to not comply with the ESG fund, so then what happens is that I can only be matched with non-ESG investors, which are a smaller pool of capital. And to me, this has a cost because it reduces the probability to be matched with a capitalist. So that's how we model that cost to not complying with what ESG fund impose to companies. Okay, so if you don't comply, I will assume that you are matched with the probability 1 minus S divided by 1 minus eta S. S is the size of the ESG fund, how much it represents of total capital as a fraction of capital. And eta is a parameter that indexes how strong the financing friction is. So if you take, for example, that eta is equal to 1, then markets are perfect, and basically the probability to be financed does not depend on whether you comply or not to the ESG fund constraints. To the contrary, if eta, for example, is equal to 0, then it's as if, in the matching game, you have only one draw from the pool of capital. So you have a probability to be matched, which is exactly 1 minus S. So that means that, if you are unlucky and you get matched with an ESG capitalist, then you will be basically kicked out and you won't be able to finance yourself. So that's a very simple way to basically make companies listen to what ESG funds are asking. They listen because they are afraid of not getting the capital they need. Okay, so what does that mean? So basically, it means that if you step back and put yourself now in the shoes of the ESG fund, the ESG fund is going to require a level of pollution EHAT that will be exactly making entrepreneurs indifferent between complying or not complying. That's the best you can do if your goal is to have impact. Basically, you are going to try to make everybody comply and choose to basically adopt EHAT as their own technology. And to do that, to make sure that they comply, basically, you can only go as far as making them indifferent with not complying, in which case they will get a smaller probability that you see here on the left-hand side of the equation at the bottom. So 1 minus S divided by 1 minus eta S, that's the probability to be matched. And then 1 is simply the production that you manage to produce if you do not comply, since you can afford to have a maximum amount of pollution. Okay, so that's kind of the key equation, basically, because it basically shows that ESG funds can have an impact. The bigger they are, the more they can be impactful by making entrepreneurs basically worried that if they don't comply, they will have access to a pool of capital that is too small. Okay, so let me skip that and let me now go to the two sectors economy. So at this stage, well, we have this sort of first result that, in Equilibrium, we have this ESG fund. It can produce competitive returns and still have an impact by converting everybody to its own standards. And it does that by making people indifferent between complying or not. So now let's try to introduce a more complex economy. And that will be useful for a couple of reasons. One of them is that having two sectors is going to allow me to speak about the supply chain and the extent to which the impact of the ESG fund can be amplified by the possibility to ask for constraints not only on the technology that firms are using, but also the kind of suppliers that they use for their production. So now I'm going to assume two industries, 1 and 2, the utility of the entrepreneur still, like Cobb Douglas. So I generalize a little bit the previous simple model. So it's a Cobb Douglas function of C1 and C2. On the denominator, you have E1 and E2, the pollution of each industry. This can be different sorts of pollutions. For example, E2 could be radioactivity and E1 could be CO2, or it could be the same. And then, so I still have a mass 1 of atomistic entrepreneurs. They each run a firm. They need to choose their industry. And they also have a production function that is using goods from the other industry. So that's the new part here. Y is not only dependent on pollution, it also depends on the quantity of inputs that you use from the other industry. Okay, so let's solve for the equilibrium. So as before, you have a mass of capitalists. They are selfish, so they don't basically want to invest in funds that don't give them the best performance that they can get in terms of financial returns. And so they can give money either to regular funds or to an ESG fund that is going to maximize welfare. but under the constraint that they provide returns as good as outside options. Again, I assume a fraction S of capitalists go to the ESG fund if the ESG fund is competitive. So here is the timing. So same as before, each capitalist has to choose whether they give their money to the ESG fund or not. Then they announce the industry weights in each industry that they are going to apply to their portfolio. They announce the pollution limits that they are going to apply to companies in each industry. So this can be different a priori, right? They don't have to ask for the same level of pollution in industry 1 versus industry 2. Then entrepreneurs choose their industry and their pollution level. Then capital and entrepreneurs are matched. Then production occurs and the profits of companies are shared between entrepreneurs and capitalists. And last, individuals are going to choose consumption on a competitive goods market. So by definition, an equilibrium is going to be a vector of prices, a vector of returns for being an investor in industry 1, in industry 2, or in the ESG fund. And these vectors of prices have to be such that all individuals maximize utility, taking prices and emissions as given, markets for goods and capital clear, and the ESG fund is choosing its policy such that aggregate utility is maximized. Okay, so there is a first result. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but it's basically using Cobb-Douglas, which is not totally general. It helps to solve things in closed form, and it gives us a simple way to think about the equilibrium, because basically the size of industries is going to be unshakable due to the Cobb-Douglas specification. So here, basically, the size of each industry is going to be set by the exogenous parameters. And in fact, there is no way for ESG funds to make industries smaller. So basically, the total capitalistic size of an industry, the book value, if you want, that is going to be invested in an industry, it's not going to be affected by ESG, the size of the ESG fund. So that's very much like the Bill Gates quote that was saying, look, there is no way to capital starve funds unless you are willing to give up on returns. And the second result is that social welfare, so the utility of a representative consumer, can be simply described as a function of the level of pollution, E1 and E2 in each industry. And all the rest is basically exogenous parameters of the model. So that helps a lot describing, in a sense, the welfare that is achieved in the economy. So there is a first best social optimum that can be computed as before. And so we have this formula E star that tells us, you know, in a perfect world where the social planner could impose technologies and pollution limits, that's how much each sector will be polluting. That's going to be useful later when we think of priority industries. In a sense, an industry that has some kind of priority is one where the gap between the laissez-faire pollution, which is 1, and this level of pollution is pretty big. So for example, if it's very easy in terms of cost to implement lower pollution, then it's basically a low-hanging fruit, right, for the ESG industry to try to force this industry to pollute less. Okay, so now what do the ESG investors do? So well, remember, they try to maximize social welfare subject to the constraints that they provide competitive returns. So they cannot subsidize companies, in a sense, to be more virtuous. So the best they can do is announce a standard EHAT in each industry and, you know, choose it such that companies ex ante are indifferent between complying or not complying. And so as before, we have this EHAT level that is a function of the matching function parameters. So basically, if really not complying has a big impact on the probability to get capital, so assuming the matching friction is big, then you will be able to impose a lower EHAT, meaning reduce pollution more, everything else equal. The last thing to take into account now is portfolio constraints. So basically the total, I mean, the capital invested in industry 1 and industry 2 has to add up to S, which is the total capital managed by the ESG fund. So now I can describe actually fully the optimal policy of the ESG fund. So what we show is the following. If the fund is small enough, so below a critical threshold K lower bar, what is going to be optimal is to invest all the capital of the ESG fund into one industry. And I will tell you how this industry is picked, but it's a kind of comparative advantage result, right? It's like there is an industry where the impact for each dollar invested is really bigger than in the other one. And so you choose to put all your guns in that battle, basically. Now there is a threshold of capital above which it becomes optimal to invest in both industries. And so you, I mean, as your capital S goes up, you know, you are going to basically impose tighter and tighter constraints to both industries. And then there is a critical threshold that is lower than the total amount of capital in the industry, such that actually you can impose first best. So even if, you know, there is not 100% of investors who are ESG, you can actually impose first best as long as there is a big enough amount of investors. So what happens in equilibrium is the following. So in this graph, I described the three zones I just spoke about. On the left hand side, first, what you have on the horizontal axis is the total amount of capital managed by the ESG fund. And on the vertical axis, I have put various equilibrium outcomes that describe the economy. In blue, you have aggregate utility. So clearly, I mean, the more ESG capital you have, the better welfare is. It plateaus after a while, but basically, unsurprisingly, you know, like ESG funds do have some impact, and in line with their goal, they increase the level of welfare in the economy. So how do they do that? They do that by reducing pollutions, so E1 and E2, which are in green. So you see that if the amount of ESG capital is small enough, then you only focus on curbing emissions in one industry. So that's the green line at the bottom. You see that as capital becomes bigger, industry 2 is going to pollute less and less, and you leave industry 1 totally untouched. So it's going to actually pollute 1, right, which is the laissez-faire amount of pollution. And only after you reach a first threshold, you are going to start having an impact on sector 1 as well. And you see the plain green line starting to decrease, showing that actually sector 1 is also now starting to behave better. One last thing to keep in mind is, okay, so what about quantities in this economy? In fact, and that's, you know, maybe to be expected, but the total GDP reduces as the ESG fund becomes bigger. So there is no magic bullet here. The ESG fund is actually achieving better social welfare by making companies produce a bit less than what they would under the laissez-faire equilibrium, right? So there is a reduction in GDP, even though there is an increase in the total aggregate welfare in the economy. So that describes what happens in the economy. And one last intuition I want to pass to you is how will you pick the sector in which you want to specialize as the ESG fund? So I told you, okay, if ESG investors represent a small fraction of capital, what is the industry where they should specialize? And so what's interesting is that there are three things they should have in mind when doing so. One thing is purely thinking about the economic efficiency of making firms more, polluting less. So basically, if the gap 1 minus E star between the laissez-faire level of pollution and the first best level of pollution is very big, well, that gives you a reason to try to really interfere with what's happening in that industry, because it can have a big impact on social welfare. So that's the first input of that equation, and that's pure economic efficiency. And then you have two things. So you have the size of the financial friction. Remember that if I have no financial friction, meaning eta is equal to 1, then there is simply no way to impact companies in this economy. So you are going to basically like get a sense of whether there are some industries where the financial friction is bigger. If that's the case, gives you a comparative advantage to intervene in that sector. And the last effect is the size effect. Basically, the idea is if a sector is very big, an ESG fund, even when it is injecting all its capital in that sector, will have an impact that is more diluted because the size of the sector is bigger. So it might be worth specializing in one sector where you can become a big fish. For example, say if you put all your capital on solar panels or some industry that you decide to specialize in, you are going to have more of an impact in that sector because entrepreneurs are going to perceive you as an important fraction of total pool of capital available to them. So before concluding, let me just discuss a bit the supply chain. So one thing that is quite natural to do in this model is now to add one layer of one dimension of action for the ESG fund, which is to impose indirect emission limits. So like scope 3, limits in the language of the ESG rating industry. So basically the idea is to say, look, we are going to basically like monitor or screen companies, not only on their direct emissions, but also the indirect emissions, which are the emissions of their suppliers. And so when we do that, what we show is that it gives a way for the ESG fund to amplify its impact. It actually accentuates the reasons to focus on one industry and try to indirectly impact the other industry. Just to conclude on this, one interesting aspect of what happens in this model when you integrate the supply chain is that endogenously, the industry that is the supplier industry is going to split into two segments of markets, a dirty segment and a compliance segment, which is going to be able to supply goods to companies that want to comply with the ESG fund. And so you have this endogenous segmentation of markets with two prices that are going to be distinct. Clean goods are going to be more expensive than dirty goods. In this model, consumers also consume the intermediary goods, and so consumers, for example, are going to consume dirty goods because they don't care. Of course, we could include in their preferences, some taste for being compliant, but in this model, we chose the route of basically assuming selfish entrepreneurs. So let me summarize and give a few policy implications. So my initial question was, can ESG reduce negative corporate externalities? So what we say is yes, assuming that there is enough financial friction so that capital markets are not fully liquid and efficient. Otherwise, basically, there is no way for a fund to have an impact without reducing its expected return. And the second is to have an impact, ESG funds need to finance firms that comply with production standards that are greener than the laissez-faire. So that's sort of obvious, but basically you need some commitment power of the ESG fund. And so how can the ESG fund maximize impact? So what we say is, if the quantity of capital that is truly ESG is small, then it should probably focus on one sector and pick that sector so that it is actually like having more of an impact. Let me finish by giving a few, I think, practical policy implications, and that's also a bit food for thought about what could be done to improve the impact of the ESG capital in our economy. So the first thing is, in this model, and that's a bit implicit, coordination among ESG investors is crucial. So I've been talking about one ESG fund, and the implicit assumption is that they can all put together, join their forces, if you want, they would have much less impact if they were dispersed and not able to choose common objectives. The second thing is that I think one outcome of this model, which I think is sort of realistic, is that ESG investors should pick their battles. They should prioritize the sectors where they intervene instead of trying to be present in every sector at the cost of diluting their impact. Number three, so I think there is a comparative advantage of ESG investors if their goal is to have impact, to focus on segments where markets are less efficient. And so I'm thinking about private equity, primary offerings, as opposed to liquid shares of large companies that are traded on the stock market, and small companies that also are more subject to financial frictions. Fourth, optimizing the carbon footprint of a portfolio does not maximize impact. So I think that's something to keep in mind, because that's sort of the objective of many funds. That's how, for example, Morningstar is categorizing funds as responsible or not responsible. It's by looking at whether they have a good carbon footprint or a good ESG rating footprint. Number five, the supply chain is a powerful tool to amplify impact. You can put constraints not only on what companies do, but what the suppliers are doing. Number six, I think one consequence of all this is, for impact to happen, reliable firm-level information is key, and that's probably where regulators can help. So the European Commission is taking seriously these issues of making sure that companies disclose reliable and detailed information, so that investors can actually, screen when they invest in companies. And maybe number seven, which is really timely, it's at times where public capital is needed, I think it's useful to make sure that it's useful for governments to feel that they should act as the ESG fund. In a sense, they should try to make companies internalize externalities. That's totally natural to do. They should not feel that it's some kind of heterodox approach to their role. Clearly, the government is well placed to think about externalities, and it should use whatever bargaining power it has as an investor of last resort to make companies adjust their production function. Okay, that's it. So thanks a lot. And now we can have room for the debate.
So your model is driven by search frictions?
Yeah.
Basically all the effects. I mean, just in a general way, could you think of other frictions that could yield similar results in a way? Or so there may be a connecting question. Other models, I mean, also show, like the Hytale-Krauss, they also show price effects without frictions, just by kind of portfolio optimization concerns. I think not getting too exposed to certain companies too much. Would that also, how does that play into your thoughts?
So here the market is efficient, meaning that there is no underreaction to arbitrage, right? So I think a lot of ESG funds have in mind that they can use ESG information to reduce risk or to even improve returns by selecting companies that will be more adapted to the future regulatory environment. So here there is nothing like that, because we assume markets are not informationally inefficient. So information is well understood by the market. We could have a model where we don't have this search friction, but we have some private benefits by investors to investing in, to have an impact. So for example, imagine you have some investors that say, hey, I am willing to give up 20 basis points of returns per year if I can have some substantial impact on social welfare. So then the model could give an answer about, what would be the optimal portfolio of a fund that tries to cater to these investors and try to make the best use of their willingness to have lower returns for some impact, some social impact. So that would be another route, but it will be a route that predicts, that assumes that impact funds or ESG funds are willing to give up on returns. But I think there is no really other route. So I think I would say there are three possibilities. One is underreaction by markets, where basically ESG investors are smarter, so to speak, and they use information that everybody should use, but somehow some people have not caught up with the situation. I'm not a bit, I mean, maybe that's a possibility, but I don't think it can be a long-term possibility. Like, there is no reason the market will underreact permanently, right? It's almost an oxymoron. At some point, it has to realize that climate change is there. Second possibility is the model we provide with the short friction. And the third possibility would be private benefits in the utility function of some investors. I think that's the main possibilities I see. And that's, yeah.
If there's no one else at this point, I'd like to ask also on this matter of frictions. I think this is a very interesting implication that you provide. And have you thought about, so the practical question is, in which markets do we see a lot of frictions, and has the ESG funds, have they sort of picked the right battles so far? I don't know if you have a perspective on whether maybe the market for solar power, I mean, there has been quite substantial investment in there, and likewise in the coal. Coal is a sector that quite a few funds have pulled out. And I'm wondering, I mean, mostly it's in public equity, so it seems a rather liquid market with little frictions, or would you see it otherwise?
No, I share this concern. I mean, I think the ESG industry has focused on liquid equities, maybe for a historical reason, because that's where there were, more reliable information and ratings that could be provided at the company level. But I think, as you mentioned, that in private equity or also in primary offerings, right, you can have much more impact. So I think that, for example, debt, primary offerings of debt is probably also a good place where, if BlackRock, Fidelity, and Vanguard tell to companies, look, we won't even consider investing at the IPO level or in a primary offering of debt, if the company cannot show that it fulfills some basic standards. I think that's a very powerful mechanism, because I think most investors will decide to actually clean up their production to make sure that they are eligible to this pool of capital. But I agree that once a company is large and its stock is floating on a large exchange, you have much less grip to threaten it, basically. So the bargaining power is lower, and then maybe engagement becomes more of a tool that you can use. But again, it will be at the cost of having lower returns than competitors, unless you are in a situation where you think that companies are not maximizing shareholder value, right? Because the CEO is not sufficiently aware of climate change. But again, I don't think this is a generic case for large companies. I think that people are more and more aware that they have to basically make sure that the business plans are adapted to realistic scenarios about climate change.
So concerning the coordination you addressed, of course, it's never going to be possible to really act all together as if all ESG investors were one fund. Do you think that a critical threshold can be reached with a reasonable amount of effort? Or do you think that this is really far away and we basically have to search for other ways?
No, I think there is actually quite a bit of coordination happening through common initiatives, investors pooling, joining their forces to basically, like delegating, for example, engagement with a company to, you have some syndication of investors on these issues that I find quite in line, in a sense, with the model. I think people are quite aware that if everybody goes with their own initiatives and own idiosyncratic fights, they are going to have very small impact individually. But that said, so I think, and that's interesting. So maybe social preferences vary a bit across countries. So here it's implicitly a kind of one country or one region model, but it's interesting that on topics like even like nuclear energy, or like it seems there are like big differences across countries in terms of what people see as optimal. So yeah, no, but I think it's your question is quite broad. I think coordination is definitely needed to expect some kind of impact. I think investors are aware about it, but I think a limit to that is that actually there are country specificities in terms of what people believe is more important or more acceptable. Yeah.
Thank you, Augustin, very much for
Thanks a
being
lot.
here and
Thank
sharing your
you.
ideas.